I remember that day vividly, even though I was only a 6-year-old child. The fateful day that changed my entire life. The scent of freshly baked cookies still lingered in the air, and the golden sunset cast a warm orange hue over everything. But just a few minutes later, the house became unbearably cold. Because my mother was gone. Gone without looking back. My name is Hannah, and that was the day I learned that not everyone keeps their promises. That day, my father was away on a business trip, and it was just my mother and me at home. I was playing with my favorite doll when the doorbell rang. My mother stood up quickly, her hand gripping the edge of her dress, as if she were hiding something. I watched her, curious, but she turned back to me and told me to go to my room. "Hannah, be a good girl and go play in your room." Her voice was hurried, not like usual. I didn't like obeying orders when I didn't know what was happening. I cracked my bedroom door open slightly, peeking down the stairs. A tall man stood at the door, wearing a gray shirt, holding a travel bag. My mother was hastily stuffing clothes into a suitcase, her face tense. I stepped out of my room, my heart pounding. "Mom, where are you going?" I asked, my voice trembling. She stopped packing and turned to look at me. Her eyes swept over me for just a moment, but there was no warmth in them. Only distance, as if I were a stranger. "I have to go away for a while, sweetheart. Be good, okay?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But, when will you come back?" She didn't answer right away. She glanced quickly at the man, then knelt down and placed a hand on my shoulder. But that touch wasn't as warm as I had hoped. It was distant. Cold. "Don't be long, Hannah, I promise." But that was a promise she never kept. The door slammed shut in front of me, the sound echoing through the empty house. I ran to the window just in time to see the car pulling away. My mother didn't turn back. She didn't wave goodbye. I stood there, my tiny hands pressed against the cold glass, waiting. But then the sun set. Darkness crept into the room, swallowing my last bit of hope. I waited for my mother all night. Then one day. Then 2 days. No one came. The fridge was empty. I didn't know how to cook, only how to rummage for stale cookies and drink tap water. At night, the big house turned into a terrifying place, shadows lurking in every corner. I curled up on the living room floor, clutching my doll. The wind howling through the windows like whispers calling my name. I cried, I screamed for my mother, but no one answered. Until on the 3rd day, I heard footsteps outside. A loud knock on the door, followed by the familiar voice of Mrs. Peterson, our next-door neighbor. "Hannah, are you in there?" The door burst open. Light from the hallway spilled in, making me squint. Then suddenly the house was full of people. Police officers. Neighbors. A paramedic knelt beside me, checking to see if I was okay. But I only looked around, searching for a familiar face. And then I saw my father. My father, David, rushed into the living room as if the entire world were collapsing beneath his feet. When he saw me, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "Hannah." He called my name, his voice breaking. I threw myself into his arms, clinging to him as if letting go meant I would be abandoned again. Over his shoulder, I saw a police officer holding a piece of paper, his expression grim. He handed it to my father. Dad unfolded it and I saw his face change. His strong features went pale, his shoulders trembling. Then he whispered as if speaking to himself. "She's gone." I didn't understand it then, but later, I learned. My mother had left a letter. A short note, with no explanation, no apology. Just a simple message. "David, I can't live this life anymore. Don't look for me." And that was it. From that moment on, I was no longer just a carefree child. I was Hannah. The girl who was abandoned by her mother. The girl afraid of the dark. The girl who would always fear that one day, the people she loved would disappear. Forever. When my mother left, life for my father and me was never the same again. My father, David, did his best to be both a dad and a mom. But I could see the exhaustion in his eyes every time he came home late from work, his tie loosened, his shoulders heavy with weariness. Simple dinners of sandwiches and instant noodles became routine. My clothes were often washed with the wrong colors, and some days I ended up wearing a shrunken sweater because the dryer was set to the wrong temperature. But those weren't the worst things. The worst were the nights when Dad didn't make it home before I fell asleep. I hated sleeping alone. The dim glow of my small nightlight wasn't enough to chase away the darkness that surrounded me when I closed my eyes. The feeling of being abandoned crept over me again, making me curl up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I used to cry silently under the covers, but never dared to tell Dad. He was already tired enough. Then one day when I was 8 years old, Helen appeared. Dad took me to a small cafe, where the air smelled of freshly baked pastries and coffee. A woman was waiting for us. She wore a soft blue sweater, her wavy brown hair cascading gently over her shoulders. When she saw me, her eyes lit up with a warm smile. "Hi, Hannah." Her voice was gentle but not distant. I didn't know how to react. I wasn't used to strangers. But something about her made me feel safe. Dad and Helen started seeing each other more often. Every time I went with Dad, she always had a small bag filled with homemade cookies. She never tried to force me into conversations or treat me like a poor, helpless child. And then one day, when Dad asked if I wanted to go to the park, I found myself asking, "Is Helen coming?" Dad looked at me slightly surprised, then smiled. "Yes, she is." From that moment on, Helen's presence became a normal part of my life. Dad told me that Helen would be moving in with us. I didn't object. I didn't know how to describe it, but with Helen around, the house no longer felt as cold as before. She never tried to replace my mother. She never asked me to call her mom. But she knew how to brush my hair without tangling it in the morning. She knew I liked chocolate chip cookies more than oatmeal ones. She knew I couldn't sleep if my room was too dark. So she quietly placed a moon-shaped nightlight by my bed without saying a word. One night, when I woke up terrified from a nightmare, Helen stepped into my room and knelt beside my bed. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked, her voice calm and warm. I shook my head, hot tears rolling down my cheeks. She didn't push me. She simply pulled the blanket up gently and said softly, "I'll sit here for a while. If you ever want to talk, I'm always here to listen." I didn't respond, but when she held my small hand, I didn't pull away. And for the first time in a long while, I slept peacefully through the night. Helen wasn't my mother. But she was the only one who made me feel like, maybe, I wasn't alone anymore. That day the door opened, and the world I had known shattered. I had just stepped into the living room after school, when I saw my father standing there, his face rigid, his hands clenched as if he were trying to hold something back. Beside him was Helen, her eyes red, and standing at the door was a woman I never thought I'd see again. My mother. She looked different, yet nothing about her felt unfamiliar. Her golden hair curled lightly, her blue eyes still sharp as I remembered, but now, there was something distant, something cold in her gaze. Beside her stood a little girl, around 5 years old, with light brown curls and wide, curious eyes. She clutched a worn-out teddy bear in her tiny hands, pressing herself against her mother's side. "Hello, Hannah." My mother's voice was soft, like a passing breeze, but there was something sharp hidden within it. I didn't know how to react. My whole body froze as old memories flooded back. The sound of the car driving away, the darkness swallowing the house, the unbearable feeling of being abandoned, rising once again like a nightmare coming to life. Helen touched my shoulder lightly, her voice slightly unsteady. "David, can we talk in private?" Dad nodded, but before he left he looked at me, his eyes filled with conflict. "Hannah, come here." Inans didn't want to, but my feet moved forward on their own. "This is..." Dad hesitated. My mother didn't wait for him to finish. She placed her hand on the little girl's shoulder, gently pushing her forward. "This is Emma," she said, her voice unusually sweet. "She's... your sister?" My heart stopped. I stared at the girl, my mind completely blank. Sister? I couldn't say a word. I didn't know what to feel. From the kitchen I heard Helen's voice tremble as she spoke to Dad. David, you can't do this. But my mother's voice followed immediately, firm and unwavering. She needs her father, David. And with just one sentence, the balance tipped in my mother's favor. Helen left just 2 weeks later. I didn't ask her why. I didn't need to. From the night my mother returned, I had already known this would happen. She hugged me before she left, holding me tighter than ever. I love you so much, Hannah, she said, her voice breaking. I wanted to hold on, to tell her not to go, but I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, watching her car drive away, just like years ago when I had watched my mother disappear. The only difference was that this time, I had no more tears left to cry. My mother quickly reclaimed her place in the house, as if the past 5 years of absence had never happened. But one thing was clear. I was no longer a part of her world. I watched as she doted on Emma, brushing her hair, placing kisses on her forehead. I watched as she spent time with her, took her shopping, read her bedtime stories. Things she had never done for me. Dad tried to balance everything, to make things right. But I saw it, day by day, how he was slowly sinking deeper into my mother's trap. Family dinners were now just Mom, Dad, and Emma. I was just an extra, a silent shadow in my own home. And the worst part was, no one seemed to notice. Except me. As the years passed, I came to a bitter realization. In this house, I was no longer my father's daughter. I was an outsider, a spectator, watching my mother and Emma build a world that I had no place in. At breakfast, Mom would carefully stack golden pancakes on Emma's plate. And for me? A bowl of cold cereal with nearly expired milk. On family outings, Mom excitedly took pictures, holding Emma in her arms. I was never invited into the frame. On holidays, under the Christmas tree filled with beautifully wrapped gifts, Emma would tear open box after box. And me? If I was lucky, I'd get a cheap gift card. I endured it in silence. Because every time I tried to speak up, Mom would smile, sickly sweet, and then give me that look of quiet reprimand. Hannah, don't be so selfish, your sister is still young, she needs love. At first, Dad still tried to keep things balanced, but as time went on, he only grew more exhausted. I saw it in his eyes every time Mom cried, every time Emma pouted and pretended to be upset. I stopped waiting. I knew no one would ever choose me. I counted down the days until I could leave that house. When I turned 18, I applied to a university as far away as possible. Zoology, studying wildlife, became my sole focus. Because I knew that animals didn't lie, didn't manipulate, didn't abandon anyone. The day I received my acceptance letter, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my chest. But that joy only lasted until dinner that night, when I told Dad I was leaving. My mother set her fork down on the table, the sound of porcelain clinking like a knife slicing through the air. College, she raised an eyebrow. Do you really think about running away, Hannah? I clenched my hands under the table. It's not running away. It's my future. Emma scoffed, whispering something that made Mom chuckle. Dad looked at me, hesitation written all over his face. I had hoped, even just a little, that he would tell me to stay. That he would say he was proud of me. But instead, he sighed. If that's what you want, I'll support you. That was it. I was truly alone. College was the first real freedom I had ever known. I buried myself in books, research projects, and volunteer work at an animal rescue center. I had no time to miss home. Or rather, I had no home to miss. But the moment I graduated, a call from my mother pulled me back to reality. Hannah, I think it's time for you to be independent. Her voice was light as a breeze, but there was a sharpness in every word. We've kept your room for the past 4 years. But Emma is older now. She needs her own space. I gripped my phone tightly, my heart pounding. What do you mean? I mean, you can't stay here forever, she said, not even bothering to hide her indifference. Adults need to learn to stand on their own. I let out a dry laugh. Right, but not Emma, right? She was silent for a second, then responded softly. Emma is still young. She needs a family. I closed my eyes, the pain squeezing my chest. I understood now. In my mother's eyes, I had never been part of this family. I hung up. And the next day, I left. No goodbyes, no looking back. There are moments in life that make you see the truth. Moments when everything you once believed turns to dust. For me, that moment came on a fateful evening. I had never wanted to return to that house. But after graduation, I hadn't secured a stable job yet, and Dad offered to let me stay for a while, until I got on my feet. I agreed, but, deep down, I knew I shouldn't have. The tense family dinners, my mother's cold stares, Emma's smug smiles. Each day was a reminder that I didn't belong there. And then, that night, I finally understood that I had never truly had a family. I came home late after an interview. As I stepped inside, the living room lights were still on, and my mother's voice carried through the quiet air. I stopped on the staircase, silently stepping into the shadows, when I heard my name. "Mom, we have to do something." Emma's voice was sharp with urgency. "I can't accept that Hannah gets part of Dad's estate." A chill ran down my spine. "Calm down, sweetheart," my mother replied, her tone steady but laced with something sharper beneath. "Your father is still too sentimental about her, but if we take things slowly, he'll see what's right. But Dad is always soft on her. If we don't do anything, I'll have to share everything that should rightfully be mine." My heart pounded, hot blood rushing to my head. "I know, darling," my mother sighed. Then she spoke in a hushed voice, as if revealing a dark secret. "We have to make her leave on her own. Make her feel like she has no reason to stay. Once she's gone, your father won't have anything reminding him of her anymore. And by then, changing the will only be a matter of time." I froze. Everything had never been clearer. They had never seen me as part of this family. To them, I was just excess. An obstacle that needed to be removed. I stepped into my room, closed the door, and leaned against it, my heart pounding wildly. In the darkness, I tried to steady my breathing, to suppress the anger and pain rising in my chest. My mother, Emma. They had always wanted me gone. Without a moment of hesitation, I pulled my suitcase from under the bed, opened my closet, and stuffed everything important inside. I didn't need much. I just needed to leave. I had once thought I could endure it, that I could hold on to some part of this family. But I was wrong. They had already decided to cut me out of their lives. And now, I would do the same. No goodbyes. No looking back. I left that house at dawn, without a word. The small suitcase rolled over the brick pavement, the sound of its wheels scraping against the quiet morning air. I didn't turn around. There was no reason to. I had once been afraid of leaving. But in that moment, I felt nothing but relief. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. Finding a job right after graduation wasn't easy. I wandered from place to place, sending applications to every animal rescue center, zoo, and veterinary clinic I could find. Then, one morning, I got a call from Greenhaven Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. "We need an animal care assistant. Can you start right away?" I didn't need to think twice. "I'll be there." Greenhaven wasn't big, but it was a place that mattered. Here, I worked with wounded creatures, wild animals that had been abandoned or lost their families, injured hawks with broken wings, orphaned fawns, tiny foxes trembling in isolation. I saw myself in every single one of them. Day by day, I learned how to treat their wounds, help them recover, and, finally, release them back into the wild. I couldn't go back in time to heal my own wounds, but at least I could do it for them. Slowly, I started to feel like I belonged somewhere. After nearly a year, a better opportunity came my way. Everwood Zoo was looking for a wildlife specialist. Someone with experience in rehabilitating injured animals and studying their behavior. I sent in my application without much hope, but when the call came, I almost couldn't believe it. "We're very impressed with your experience. If you're available, we'd love to meet you on Monday." Everwood Zoo was much larger than Greenhaven. It wasn't just a place to house animals, it was involved in major conservation projects. Here, I had the chance to work with animals I had only read about in books: snow leopards, gray wolves, great horned owls. The job was demanding, but every single day I felt like I was moving forward. I was no longer the girl left behind in the dark. Despite my busy schedule, I made time to join an online forum for animal lovers. That's where I met Jake. At first, we only talked about general topics: how to care for injured animals, methods for restoring hunting instincts in wild creatures. But over time, our conversations became more personal. Jake had a great sense of humor. He always knew how to make me laugh, even on my worst days. "If you could be any animal, what would you be?" he once asked me. I thought for a moment before answering. Maybe a fox. Always cautious, always keeping its distance. He was silent for a moment, then replied, "Then I'll be the one who waits patiently from afar, until you feel safe enough to come closer." My heart skipped a beat. But no matter how kind Jake was, I was still afraid. I had once believed in love. I had once thought that having a family meant unconditional care. But the past had taught me that attachments were fragile. One day, they would shatter. So if I let Jake into my life, would he one day leave just like my mother did? That day, I hadn't intended to revisit my past. But the past found me instead. I was standing in line at a cafe near the zoo, exhausted after a long shift. The rich aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, its warmth soothing me. I was scrolling through my phone when a voice spoke right beside me. "Hannah." I froze. That voice. It was too familiar. I turned around and there, standing right in front of me, was Helen. The time had passed, but she looked just as I remembered. Those warm brown eyes, her hair a little longer, and a smile that was both surprised and emotional. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then, before I could stop myself, I threw my arms around her, feeling as if a lost part of me had finally found its way back. "I've missed you so much, Hannah," she whispered, her voice breaking. I couldn't speak, I just nodded, trying to hold back the emotions swelling in my chest. We sat down in a quiet corner of the cafe, our conversation flowing, as if no years had passed between us. Helen told me that after leaving my house, she focused on work, trying to rebuild her life. But 2 years ago her sister passed away, leaving behind a 6-year-old boy named Mike with no one to care for him. Without hesitation, Helen took him in. She showed me a photo: a boy with brown hair, a mischievous smile, but something guarded in his eyes. "Raising a child isn't easy," Helen sighed. "But I couldn't abandon Mike. He lost his family, just like you once did." I understood that feeling more than anyone. As we left the cafe, Helen hesitated before asking, "Hannah, would you like to meet Mike? I'm sure he'd love to meet you." It took me a few seconds to answer. Then, I nodded. A few days later, I visited Helen's home. Her apartment was smaller than the house she used to live in, but it was filled with warmth. At first Mike was shy, but before long he started telling me about his pet turtle, his favorite comic books, and how much he hated eating broccoli. Watching him, I saw a glimpse of my younger self, a child who had been hurt, always searching for a place to belong. "Hannah, I like you," Mike suddenly declared, as he sat at the table, coloring. I smiled. "I like you too, kid." Helen watched us, her eyes filled with the warmth I had longed for all these years. For the first time in forever, I felt like I had a real family. A week later, Helen had an emergency and asked me to watch Mike for the evening. He sat quietly on the couch, playing on my laptop while I prepared dinner. I wasn't paying attention. Until I heard his shaky voice. "Hannah, I think I did something wrong." I turned around to see him holding my laptop, his face pale. "You had a folder labeled drafts." I was just curious and opened it, and I accidentally hit send. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. "Send what, Mike?" He swallowed hard. "Your emails. I didn't know they were that important." I rushed to the screen. Panic crashed over me like a storm. Every email I had ever written but never dared to send. Letters filled with emotions meant for my father. Confessions I had never spoken to Jake. The pain I had tried so hard to bury. All of it had been sent. I could barely breathe. The secrets I had kept locked inside were no longer under my control. It felt like my entire world had collapsed. The laptop screen remained lit, the words "sent mail" blinking like a sentence being passed. Every email I had written, all the pain, the hurt, the unspoken truths, were no longer just mine to keep. They were in my father's inbox, and Jake's. I sank into the chair, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails nearly dug into my skin. Mike looked at me, his eyes filled with worry. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I didn't mean to." I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. There was no way to take it back. No way to hide it anymore. Now, all that was left was to wait and see what would happen next. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning my phone rang. I looked at the screen. "Dad?" I couldn't pick up. I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to face him. But then, a message appeared. "Hannah, I need to see you, please." Just those last 3 words were enough to tell me that this time, things were different. We met at a small cafe, the same place where I had reunited with Helen. I walked in, my heart pounding against my ribs. My father was already there, looking more exhausted than I remembered. When he saw me, there was a pain in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. I pulled out a chair and sat down, waiting in silence. He slowly placed his hands on the table, his fingers trembling slightly. "I read your emails." I said nothing. He swallowed hard, his gaze steady on me. "I didn't know, Hannah. I didn't know how much you were hurting." I let out a dry laugh. "How could you not know? It was always right in front of you, you just didn't want to see it." He closed his eyes for a second, as if absorbing every word I said. When he opened them again, I saw regret in them. "I was wrong. I let your mother manipulate me. I let Emma overshadow you. I thought keeping the peace was enough, but in doing that, I lost you." I bit my lip, refusing to let my emotions spill over. Dad took a deep breath before speaking again. "I can't change the past, but I want to fix the future. If you'll give me a chance." I looked at him for a long moment, searching for sincerity in his words. And for the first time in years, I didn't see a weak man. I saw my father, the man I had once trusted as a child. I nodded. "I won't believe words anymore. You'll have to prove it. With actions." He gave me a sad smile. "I know." When I got home, my mind was still reeling from our conversation when another message appeared on my phone screen. "Jig." I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened it. "I got your email, Hannah. I had no idea you've been carrying so much." I sat down on my bed, my heart racing. "I want you to know that you're not alone. And I don't know any better way to say this, but I've liked you for a long time. I just never said anything because I was afraid of hurting you. But now, I don't want to stay silent anymore." I exhaled sharply, caught between fear and hope. The final message made my heart tighten. "If you're ready, I want to see you, not through a screen, not through texts. I want to be there. With you." I stared at the words on the screen. The past had taught me that everyone eventually leaves. But Jake was different. He was here. He had always been here. And for the first time, I thought that maybe it was time to stop running. I had hesitated when I accepted my father's invitation. Thanksgiving had never been something I looked forward to. It was always a time when I sat quietly at the table, watching my mother and Emma enjoy themselves. As if I never existed. But this time, there was something strange in Dad's voice over the phone. Calm, yet firm. "Hannah, I need you to be there. Things are going to change." I wasn't sure what to expect, but something in his tone made it impossible for me to say no. I didn't know that night would be the biggest turning point of my life. When I stepped into the house, the atmosphere was strangely tense. Mom was in the kitchen, checking on the turkey, while Emma lounged on the sofa, scrolling through her phone like nothing else in the world mattered. My father sat at the head of the dining table, his expression calm, but with something sharp hidden beneath. In front of him was a thick stack of documents, neatly placed on the wooden surface. Mom looked up, a fake smile stretching across her lips. "Oh, Hannah, you came too! What a surprise!" I didn't respond. I pulled out a chair and sat across from Dad. He cleared his throat, setting down his fork and knife before looking straight at Mom. "Linda, before we begin dinner, there are some things we need to discuss." Mom raised an eyebrow. "Tom, it's Thanksgiving. Do we really have to do this now?" Dad didn't answer. Instead, he opened the folder, pulled out a stack of papers and placed them in front of her. "Do you know what this is?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold as a blade. Mom picked them up, skimmed through, then shrugged. "Aren't these just bank statements? What's the big deal?" Dad nodded. "Yes. And if you look closely, you'll notice that over the past 2 years, a large sum of money has disappeared from my account." The air in the room instantly grew heavier. "The money that you embezzled from me." Mom froze. Dad flipped to another page. "I hired an accountant to investigate. The withdrawals were untraceable at first, but they all led to a hidden account under your name. Linda, you've been stealing from me." Mom let out a nervous laugh. "Tom, what are you even talking about? That account was just for the family's expenses." "The family?" Dad gritted his teeth. "Or for your other man." Emma stopped scrolling. The room turned to ice. Dad pulled out a set of photographs and tossed them onto the table. Clear, undeniable images. Mom in a hotel, arm in arm with a stranger, laughing. Other photos showed her embracing him, kissing him in front of an unfamiliar apartment. Mom's face drained of color. Dad leaned back in his chair, hands clasped in front of him. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I'd stay blind forever?" I stared at Mom, waiting for an explanation. But she had nothing to say. Then Dad turned to Emma. She crossed her arms, frowning. "What do you want from me?" Dad took a deep breath, his grip tightening on one last piece of paper. "Emma, I did a DNA test." Emma scoffed. "And? What for?" Dad glared at Mom. "Do you want to say it or should I?" Mom opened her mouth, but no words came out. Dad placed the DNA test results on the table, his voice turning ice cold. "Emma is not my daughter." The room nearly shattered. I heard the sound of a fork dropping onto a plate, the sharp inhale of my mother. Emma froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What?" Her voice was so small it was almost inaudible. Dad let out a long breath, as if he had been holding this in for too long. "I had my doubts for years. But I didn't want to believe it. But after everything I've learned about Linda, I had no choice." My mother screamed, "Tom, you can't do this, you can't treat her like this." Dad looked at her, his voice cutting like a blade. "And how have you treated Hannah all these years?" That question silenced her. Dad stood up, his voice firm and unwavering. "Linda, I've hired a lawyer. I'm divorcing you. And you and Emma will leave this house. Immediately." Panic flooded my mother's face as she rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "Tom, you can't abandon us like this." Dad pulled away, his eyes colder than I had ever seen. "No, Linda, you abandoned this family a long time ago." Emma turned to glare at me, hatred burning in her eyes, but I didn't care anymore. For the first time, I wasn't the one being left behind. They were. For the first time in my life, I was the one who stayed, and they were the ones who had to go. Linda and Emma disappeared from the house in a storm of rage and humiliation. My mother screamed, cursed my father, and threatened legal action, but in the end she had no choice but to leave. Emma, stripped of her usual arrogance, shot me one last hateful look before slamming the door behind her. Dad stood motionless in the living room, his shoulders sagging as if he had finally put down a burden he had carried for years. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. "I'm sorry, Hannah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I let you endure too much." Eyes didn't answer right away. Wounds from the past don't heal overnight. But in his eyes, I saw sincerity. I saw the man I had once admired, trying to make things right. I took a deep breath and said softly, "We can start over, Dad." He nodded, and I knew this time, he wouldn't leave me alone again. The months that followed were full of new beginnings. Dad and I started seeing each other more often. Morning coffees, long conversations about things we had never spoken of before. He wanted to understand me. He wanted to truly be a father I could rely on. But there was one surprise I hadn't expected. One afternoon, Dad called me into the living room, his expression both hesitant and hopeful. I reached out to Helen. My eyes widened. "You did?" He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "I needed to apologize to her, and..." "We've met a few times." My heart tightened, not in pain, but in relief. I had always believed that Helen was the only person who had truly loved me like family. If Dad could see her worth, if he could find his way back to the woman who had once brought light into our lives, then that was a good thing. I smiled, for the first time feeling like everything was finally falling into place. As for Jake, we were slowly building something I had never truly had before. A real relationship. At first I was still afraid. The wounds of the past didn't fade easily. I had grown used to keeping my distance, believing that anyone who entered my life would eventually leave. But Jake never rushed me. He was patient, always there when I needed him, yet never forcing me to open up before I was ready. "I'm not going anywhere, Hannah," he once told me when I hesitated. "No matter how long it takes for you to trust me, I'll still be here." And little by little I started to believe him. In the evenings we took walks together, sharing stories about work, about the little things in life. I told him about the animals I cared for at the zoo, about the challenges and joys I found in my work. And one day, when Jake reached for my hand in the middle of a crowded street, I didn't pull away. For the first time, I wasn't afraid anymore. Things didn't change overnight. The old wounds still lingered, and painful memories couldn't simply be erased. But I no longer let them control me. I was no longer trapped in the shadows of my past. I was no longer the girl who constantly feared that the people she loved would one day leave. Because now, I had a real family. A father trying to make up for his mistakes. A stepmother who had never given up on me. A man who patiently waited for me to open my heart. And most importantly, I had myself. Stronger, steadier, and finally finding the peace I once thought I would never have. Life isn't always fair, and sometimes, the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. But what truly matters is not how we were abandoned or betrayed, it's how we overcome that pain to find ourselves again. Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who truly love, cherish, and stand by us, no matter what. Happiness isn't about waiting for others to accept us. It's about creating a life where we no longer live in fear. What do you think about Hannah's story? Have you ever experienced something similar or felt connected to any of the characters? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt and meaningful stories about family and life.